Before going to the actual panel, I will provide a short overview of major trends and drivers of change in the Connect segment based on the results of IABM research. And after that, we will then have a panel with Vinnova and Emoji Technologies. Firstly, when looking at the key drivers of change in the Connect segment, naturally the transition to IP is one of the mega trends. When looking at our results of the research we have conducting this spring, IP transition has been slightly slower than expected because of the uncertainty over IP standards and also certain reluctance to change the existing SDI operations. However, then naturally the publication of the new SMPTE set of standards has now then increased the consensus and aims in the industry. Thirdly, also the arrival of an open solution for IP is expected to catalyze the adoption of IP technologies, particularly at the broadcast end user segment. A second very interesting trend in this Connect segment is naturally the adoption of ultra high definition and 4K immersive format, and particularly among broadcasters, it has been slower than expected because of the high deployment costs, but also certain reluctance and or more uncertainty among consumers and their willingness to adopt this new format. Naturally, last year there were several sporting events like Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, as well as the FIFA World Cup, which naturally acted as a push for the broadcasters to launch new UHD offerings. And we are likely going to see this to continue also in the coming years with Tokyo Olympics and Beijing Olympics coming up. Naturally, the big new media players and OTT players like Netflix and Amazon, they have had a very big and have a big role in this adoption because they currently accept only content which is shot in 4K and UHD, which then naturally drives forward the demand for 4K production equipment. Then when briefly looking at the key technology demand drivers in the Connect segment, these results are from the study which we conducted prior to the NAB show this spring. And we can clearly see that the transition to IP is really a mega driver, followed by remote production and also virtualization, as well as multi-platform content delivery. And then next, I would like to hand over the speech to our panelists, Laurence Venner, who is a professional video product manager in Vinnova, as well as Pedro Santos. He's the head of Academy and Media Tools Architects in Emoji Technologies. So firstly, when looking at the key drivers of change in Connect segments, are the drivers the same in your perspective as what I briefly described in the previous slides? How do you see, what are the key drivers in your view?
From our side at Vinnova, we're seeing tremendous growth in remote production, as pointed out by your slide, and production companies are starting to use the transition to IP to enable them on a journey of equipment virtualization. This means from what we're seeing that there's a tremendous increase in requirements for connectivity, and this is putting particular strain on the last mile. And obviously these are the capacity and the last mile connections are massively important in the connect domain.
And Pedro, what is your view on this?
I agree with my colleague. Technological factors is a huge trend, but also the social one, because we see people look for content in different platforms. So IP can make take advantage of this change, and also the deployment of in the clouds and use different kind of networks like 5G can bring new and interesting solutions and also experience for the final user. So I believe also social trends is something we need to take a look in these kind of connections.
Right. And given that IP is a big driver of spending in Connect segment, how do you see what is the state of adoption of IP technology in the whole broadcast and media industry? So how do you see it at the scale of the whole industry?
IP is moving forward. More and more people are adopting it. I know it's not the moment is not good enough for the market, but it's gaining traction. But I believe it's a natural path for the industry because it opens new doors, new perspective for the future, and also it enabled the possibility to don't have in premises the hardware, use only, for example, in cloud or even edge capabilities. So it's just a matter of time, in my opinion.
And how about Laurence?
Yes, I would agree with those sentiments. I think, however, we would be foolish to expect broadcasters and OB and production companies to just spend money for the sake of it. Obviously, they are only going to spend money on new equipment that they actually need to give them additional capabilities or additional capacity. I think the reason why the adoption has been slower than it was thought is kind of a bit like the teenage sex analogy. Everybody thinks that everybody else is doing more of it and doing it better than they are. So when asked the question, people would have that kind of teenage sex analogy in the back of their mind. And but now what we're seeing, is people who are beginning to look at this because they need to have wide color gamut or HDR capacity. Then any equipment that's bought now has to have a path to IP connectivity, or as Pedro mentioned, the path to virtualization.
Right. Yes. Then this leads to actually the third question. So there has been a lot of hype around cloud and virtualization in Connect segment specifically. How do you see is it really happening at the moment?
I mean, typically, the broadcasters or the people within the broadcast organizations that we talk to are engineers themselves. So initially, when we went out to talk to people about cloud, they would just roll their eyes. But now we're seeing broadcast-specific data centers. We're seeing OBs and broadcasters trying to enable their own generic compute capability so that they can spin up their own virtual machines. We've even been talking to people who are talking about generic compute in a truck.
Right.
And we're specifically seeing three main models. There's the owned model where people actually have their own generic compute capacity, either in the back of the truck or in their studio or production center. We're seeing people like Red Bee who have specific data centers connected over a global WAN, specifically so that they can share and do production across their production facilities. And we're also seeing the standard, the usual suspects, if you like, the AWSs, the Googles, et cetera. So it's certainly there. It's not something where it was just the topic of a Dilbert cartoon anymore. These things are really beginning to happen.
Right. How about Pedro? What is your opinion?
Yes, I share the same vision. The virtualization opened the market to new players like Amazon, Microsoft, Google. they now have media service, so they are new competitors in our market. But these new technologies also bring new value for our customers. For example, semantic analysis of video footage. It's nowadays it's very easy with the cloud. In the past, we needed several people looking in the video. So these times is very interesting for the consumers right now.
Right. What about, to what extent does the cost and availability of IP links remain a challenge for broadcasters? What do you think?
Nowadays, the markets have plenty of IP solutions. I believe lots of brands have their own equipment and their own solution. So the cost is being adjusted and reduced little by little. Also, the availability is increasing. So it's just a matter of time. I believe it's something the decision maker needs to take this in mind. Okay, I have the cost, I have also the availability, but other kinds of points needs to be addressed. For example, the skills of the team. They need to adjust to a new technology. Also, the cables, we need to replace everything, the switches, everything needs to be adapted to this new workflow. So this takes time, and also people put the foot on the brake to not move just now, just wait a little bit to be more mainstream.
Right. Laurence, what do you think?
Yeah, so looking at this from a point of view of getting content between the events and a production center, we're seeing that a lot of links are already in place, but these links aren't infinite. They're obviously finite, and the things like the last mile are causing the problem. People generally talk about dark fiber from a point of view of thinking that it's completely dark and it's their own fiber. But what normally happens when people get a dark fiber, it means they have a circuit switched wavelength between two locations. So the bandwidth is still limited, and you're still buying a multiple of gigabits per second or tens of gigabits per second. So remote production technology ultimately needs to provide better connectivity solutions to allow people to operate at any given location. Recently, there were trials. I was reading an article on one of the trade press websites where Grass Valley and CenturyLink did a production where they had 100 gigabit per second links. But this level of connectivity just doesn't exist where you have events that are either tier 2, tier 3 events, which are prime candidates for remote production, or, for example, where the events are not regular. So, for example, touring events such as golf or Formula One. This means that really there is still a requirement for a level of compression, whether it's from the ultra low latency JPEG XS right through to the long latency things like long-GOP HEVC, which can also affect the decision making when it comes to the workflow. So we think the best compromise is to use an intra or a striped compression with bandwidth requirements in the same area as low latency HEVC, and this is where why we are in the market, and where our peeling product fits, and this is why we are in use for large scale remote productions around the world.
I see. Very, very interesting. Pedro, you mentioned already skills and cost as certain challenges when it comes to the adoption of IP. Even though there is now this open standard for IP, why are we seeing that the adoption is still slow? Could you elaborate a little bit more in detail the reasons for this, please?
Yes, I can choose only one reason for it. The industry has made a huge investment during the SD to HD conversion or to Ultra HD. The IP technology was not available at that time, so they invest in the SDI. They have these numbers in their heads, the decision makers. So they need, if it works well, why I need to change now? This is more related with the decision, not properly with the solutions available in the market. Regarding the skills, it's true the IP technology is different from the SDI. but it's something that you can retrieve some information from the IT department, because you have your operational team in the media, but you have also the IT department with knowledge about IP. So if you can make the bridge between these two worlds, you can create a more solid workflow in the IP.
Right. And Laurence, how do you see this, the main reasons for the slower than expected adoption of IP?
Yes, again, I would look at this. SDI is the incumbent player in this market, and like Pedro was saying, that people have got a huge investment in these areas. So we can't expect production companies or broadcasters to just throw out all of this infrastructure. They've got a huge investment in this infrastructure.
Right.
And when you're expanding, do you expand to a new format, a new standard for a small fraction of what is your infrastructure? Or do you look at this and say, well, actually, we have a standard here. To mix standards on one site is not feasible. Therefore, we're just going to carry on using SDI.
I see. How about then the transition to SMP GE 2110? How is it changing operational practices in your view, Pedro?
2110 brings more flexibility. It's not as necessary to have just one cable to transmit everything. You can have different routes, IP routes, to split the audio, the video, the metadata, stuff like that. So one network can have multiple virtual networks inside. This is very different from the SDI. Also, the knowledge of NCPT ST2010, the interface, the transport, it's the same for the media operational part and also for the IT. So I believe it's a challenge, but it's a challenge that you can mitigate with the help of the IT team. And also the IP standards opens the uncompressed workflows to the cloud. In my opinion, this is a huge advantage compared with the SDI. So you have now a connector that can be plugged and feeds a cloud with proper IP video. And this can leverage new business like pay-per-use in the cloud, so you don't need to have the hardware inside your premises.
Yeah, I see. Laurence, how do you see the operational practices changing?
I would agree with everything that Pedro has said. I would add one thing, though, that is that maybe two things. One is that from a large amount of the work that we've done and that we're seeing people doing is minimizing the impact that the operators, so the replay operators, the directors, etc., the people more on the creative side of the workflow see. So our job as an industry is to work with the technology people inside of the broadcasters and production companies to minimize the impact that the people working on the creative side see. But we're also seeing, in terms of specifically, is it just 2110? We're seeing a large mix of people wanting to mix standards. So, for example, in the field, you may see people wanting to stick with SDI because it's known and trusted in the when you're actually going on site to do a production. When you're going between the truck and when you're over a large distance, people may want to use something like 2022-6 because they know that it's going to keep everything in sync without having to resort to 2059. And then within the facilities themselves, we're seeing people looking to 2110. So there's going to be we think there's going to be a large mix of SDI, 2022-6 and 2110 for some time to come, with a gradual ramp up of 2110, ramp down of SDI, and also probably a ramp down probably a bit sooner as 59 becomes the more de facto standard of 2022-6.
I see. Then moving forward to the second mega trend,
UHD and 4K, it's a big driver of spending in Connect segment. How is it currently affecting your business, and how do you see this as a driver of spending for you and for your organization, Pedro?
Ultra HD is something that is on the market, but the adoption is very slow. For example, in my home country, Portugal, none of the public channels have a channel in ultra definition. I think the rest of the world, it's only used by the most advanced broadcasters. So maybe it's the price. I'm not sure here if it's a price, but I believe it's the bandwidth, because they rent the space in satellites, in the terrestrial transmitters. So it's difficult for them to find a solution that can connect well with the market, the business model, and also the clients. So it's challenging here. But I believe with the SMPT 2110 and other technologies like 5G can help it to reduce the cost of transmitting this and also the operational cost.
Right. Very interesting. What about Laurence? What is your view on 4K and UHD adoption, and also is it a driver spending for you?
Well, yes, so we would love to see more of it, but when I go to places like NAB and I listen to the CTOs, things like when they get together and they give their presentations from the broadcasters, there's this repeated message of better pixels rather than more pixels. And as an industry, we may understand this, but it doesn't solve the problem of the fact that if you go into most department stores in the UK, you will have difficulty finding a set that is not UHD. So most people are walking out with these UHD sets, and we have to be aware of this as an industry, that our customers, the consumers of their product, are purchasing UHD sets. So there is a reluctance, given the cost and the difficulties, to move to this. But we are now seeing it again at NAB this year. Cameras are now achieving the same level of sensitivity that a 1080i camera is achieving as well. So the barriers are coming down. However, there is obviously still the problem of delivery, as Pedro was mentioning, but this is the area on which OTT can step up. Although, to be fair, in this country, we are seeing two of our main broadcasters, both Sky and BT, are actually do actually have UHD services. So, but it is the OTT that is probably maybe a bigger threat to these things, which is pushing other broadcasters to look more heavily at UHD.
Interesting. And do you see that those end customers of yours, and for example broadcasters, you mentioned Sky for example, are those end customers more likely to move to UHD and adopt 4K UHD if they have already IP in place?
Well, specifically for those two broadcasters, I mean, they're a good case in point. Is they have spent a lot of money on rights, and they are selling those rights through subscriptions. And the people who are taking up those subscriptions are going to be looking at what they're getting, and the perception of the end viewer consumer is that UHD, more pixels, is better. So it really is, rather than thinking the technology is leading here, it's far more, from my perspective, I would say it's more about following the money. The consumer is paying the broadcaster, in these cases commercial broadcasters who are selling subscriptions, and they have to justify the the multi-million-pound rights deals that they're signing, and that is what's driving it. But there are still things in the marketplace that are still preventing this, such as things like, a lot of CCUs still don't have an IP output, and monitors may not have an IP output. A lot of software-based systems, it's very easy to transfer. But if you have something that has a physical spigot on the back of it to connect the SDI on it, that's going to stay that way for some time to come. And that's even true for UHD. as well.
Mm-hmm. I see. Pedro, do you agree with what Laurent said?
Definitely. I see the key point here is the end users. Nowadays they have cheaper televisions for Ultra HD. So as Laurent said, it's following the money. If more people have it on their homes, the broadcaster will receive some pressure to bring more content in Ultra HD. It's a matter of time, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Right. You mentioned earlier, both of you, that there are still end customers who prefer to stick to SDI. So what about 12G SDI? Do you see that your customers are still investing in it, or is it something that is gradually fading away from the market?
12G is here to stay, in my opinion, and it can live together with the IP. We need to take in mind that SDI is still the major technology. So people that invested it will not change in a couple of years to a new technology. And also SDI is being developed. We have now the standard for 24G is not done, but it's still be made. So I foresee some years with SDI and IP living together. Maybe some connection is necessary to have a system that is compatible with both systems and be present in the same workflow without any.
I see. How about Laurence? Do you share Pedro's view?
We're seeing very little 12G requirement coming through. We've only really seen one. It was a very significant, large RFP, but it was only one, and that was the backup. If 2110 or 2022-6 could not be provided. So we are not seeing a great deal of 12G coming through. I personally we have benefited from it. There's no doubt about that as a vendor, but as an interface, I think SDI and certainly 12 gig and 24 gig are going to be diminishing because the distances that can be achieved through a 12 gig cable limited so much.
Right. Okay. What about remote production then? Pedro already mentioned better connectivity for remote production. How do you see what is the state of remote production and how is it affecting your business at the moment, Pedro?
I know in the winter games in Europe, SVT has made some experiments with a virtual workflow based in the cloud. I don't think it's a public cloud; it's like a private one. But the people are moving to it. So remote productions, it's a trend that we need to take an eye over it, and we are doing some solutions to cope with it. And I believe it's the right path in the evolution. Also with the help of IP, this can be possible and can be made nowadays. It's not something to the future. Is something for the present.
Right. Okay. Laurence, would you like to add something to remote production?
Absolutely. Remote production for us, I think, is certainly as an intra contribution provider is a massive growth area. It's the area we're seeing the most growth, way far and away above anything in terms of IP, etc. It's where the workflows are evolving. So the workflows that need new equipment are obviously driving a market here. So we recently worked with Redbee to provide a 32 camera remote production at 10 days notice because the customer simply wanted it to do remote production, and it was 32 cameras one way, 8 return videos. Obviously there are many different arguments for and against remote production, but ultimately it does allow massive amounts of efficiency. It does allow higher standards to be gained because you can use the same talent to do more than one event, the same creatives to do more than one event. Although the downside of this, that some people will say, is that you don't get the engagement of being at site. But if you also have talent who can then go home to see their wife and kids, etc., that has also got a plus side to it as well. So, like I said, this is the major growth area, and it is all we seem to hear in terms of the creative side of the workflows that are going on at the moment.
How about then 5G rollout? Pedro already mentioned 5G in the context of UHD, how it can reduce the costs and also low latency, provide lower latency. Are these remote production and 5G, are they interlinked? And how do you see the role of 5G rollout in general in relation to reproduction and also your business in general? Pedro?
We are not talking about just a simple evolution of 4G to 5G. For example, we have products like backpacks, 4G backpacks, but 5G can help our industry to be more efficient, more competitive, and also opens the possibility to bring new experience for the consumers. 5G can leverage the adoption of other technologies like ultra high definition or remote productions. For example, in the last months, we have at least 2 trials, one from BBC and another from RTV, that use 5G. The BBC one was not so well, but the RTV went very well. So it's something the broadcasters are using, at least experimenting and bringing trials to the equation. So already here, and it needs to stay because I believe in this technology.
Interesting, very interesting. And Laurence, what is your view on 5G rollout, and also would you link it to the remote production somehow?
Well, I'm talking from central London now, and talking from central London and bearing in mind the coverage in central London is meant to already have 5G. The availability of high quality cellular coverage is patchy, and I think that this will allow broadcasters to expand their coverage. But for example, if you take the National Football Stadium at Wembley, what could be done there? You can do things like ISOs, you can do things like fan cams and things like that. And you can do things in the very constrained area where you know where you are and you have discussed it with the broadcaster. But the network operators actually have to make those network slices available to the broadcasters. They also have to make them available to the broadcasters at a favorable price. So if you're looking at a 5G contribution versus maybe a radio camera or a satellite truck, it has to be competitive with that at the same quality of standard.
Right.
And it also assumes that when you have your backpack, you stay where you're located, so you lose the mobility factor that some people have been used to in terms of maybe being on a train or doing this stuff from a mobile location, or maybe even in a car. So I see that it will augment the existing capabilities, but I don't think it's going to replace the use of trucks, the use of on-site production, whether that be remote production where the staff are actually back at the production center, or whether it's the use of actual wired tethered cameras being linked back to the site. And again, this is why we're still continuing to work with mobile vendors, the mobile connectivity vendors, these bonded cellular providers, etc., on how to gain the level of additional levels of compression so that they can maintain UHD even when they go down to a 4G or a 3G signal, because as soon as you start moving away from where you're if you like, your static base, then you get into this situation where the connectivity drops down. I know this. I go past National Stadium on the train every single day to get to the office, so I'm well aware of the level of connectivity that's in one of the so-called locations that have got this high level of connectivity.
I see. Then the final question from my side, what is coming next in Connect technology, and what is your company planning for? Pedro, please.
It's a tricky question because I know we are starting the standardization of like 5.5G or 6G. The technology will evolve naturally. Also, maybe terahertz is something that promises wireless connectivity like 100 gigabits. So maybe this is something not too far to happen in our industry. This can leverage, for example, 8K cameras to be totally wireless in a stadium, something like this. So the future can surprise us with this.
Right. We look forward to seeing 8K wireless cameras then in the future. What about Laurence? What is coming next in the Connect segment in terms of technology?
For us, I think this is a general market trend. I don't think it's specific to the Connect technology, though this is where we're seeing things go, is that CapEx is now a dirty word. There's a kind of sea change where broadcasters and production companies used to want to own a physical piece of hardware that they could hold in their hands. They don't want that anymore. They don't seem to want that anymore. You know, with IP, with virtualization and remote production, we're kind of in a situation where we have this perfect storm where these broadcasters and OB companies who are usually not pulling technology from us. We normally have to push technology to them. They're actually now pulling. We're actually getting a pull from them to actually virtualize our hardware. So this is why we're moving to much more of a SaaS-based model and much more of a virtualization model where people can just use the technologies on a consumption basis rather than actually buying perpetual licenses or actually physically owning the hardware.
We do have a question here. So it says, given the fact that UHD is a general driver of spending in Connect, how do different UHD enhancements such as HDR, HFR and wide color gamut affect your business? So who wants to jump in on that first? You want to choose someone, Rika?
Yes, Pedro, would you like to answer the question first?
In terms of connection, HDR, it's more or less the same bandwidth. Okay, we are talking about 10 bits or 12 bits per caller, but it's regarding only in terms of metadata. The challenge is not too different from the Ultra HD. It's just a matter of a little more bandwidth. So if the equipments are well balanced and the connectivity and the metadata are well transmitted between devices, I don't see this is a huge challenge. Of course, it's the coloring problem, the grading problem, but it's not related with the connection.
Interesting. And Laurence?
The same is pretty much true for us. There's very little impact of having HDR and HDR. The majority of it is handled transparently, so we don't really get involved in it. However, with the HFR, we benefit from it as the cadence of the frames increases. That also, apart from the visual aspects, that improves things for us from an engineering perspective, although obviously any system that's transporting video at a higher frame rate has to have more bandwidth available to do it.
Thank you very much, Pedro and Laurence, for your excellent insights. It was fascinating to hear your thoughts and to also a little bit simulate what the future will bring in the Connect segment.